Glad you can make it to date with us today on Earthfile. Welcome to the program. I'm Ayola Kasim. The path to a climate deal in Paris in less than 5 months from now is littered with obstacles. Foremost among them, how to differentiate between what industrialized nations led by the United States will do to cut fossil fuel pollution and what commitments developing ones such as India and Brazil will take on. Well, last week, talks between rich and poor countries in the Ethiopian capital aimed at agreeing on the financing of the United Nations' bold new global development agenda came to an end with a deal that has drawn both criticism and applause. Late last year, envoys from some 190 countries gathered in Lima took a step towards what will be first deal binding all nations to limit greenhouse gases. The 1997 climate agreement, known as the Kyoto Protocol, was a top-down apportioning of legally binding targets. The top-down approach was among the reasons why the United States never ratified Kyoto. Canada and Russia withdrew from the second commitment period of the protocol.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about the
Negotiators taking lessons from Kyoto and the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Summit's failure on top-down decisions leading to ambitious climate deal now took the pledge and review route by introducing nationally determined contributions, a bottom-up approach for a climate deal. With both temperatures and global emissions touching records, the United Nations sees a new urgency on the issue from all governments. Still, reaching any consensus is difficult at these talks, which ran over time by more than 30 hours in Lima. The main friction last year was over how the next deal should differentiate between those who have become rich on the back of burning fossil fuels and those who say they need cheap energy to eradicate poverty. A wall between richer and poorer nations is built into the discussions by the 1992 UN treaty that started the talks. The pact, which the United States was among the first to ratify, holds that the rich created global warming and should move first to fix it, and said to help the poor clean up their economies too. Since then, China has surpassed the United States as the biggest polluter, and India rose to third. Only 15% of global emissions are now covered under the Kyoto Protocol, the 1997 treaty that applies limits to industrial nations only. One of the biggest changes came in November when the United States President and the Chinese President announced a joint effort to rein in emissions. China is still classed as the developing nation, and its move helped break down the differences between camps.
One of the things that came out of Lima is that every country must now to give an account. And the Secretariat will now have to decide, put all these things together and decide what will happen as a template to Lima. However, to Paris. However, what we have been able to achieve in Lima is that we have been able to have a template to start to talk. These are issues that we are going to look at. And the point you made is also part of that issue. It's a question of interest. Can you ever imagine American president and the Chinese president meeting and agreeing to say, look, I put X amount into climate change fund. Now let us start to talk about the reduction of emission. Don't you see a changing pattern?
Since 2014 has been globally recorded as the warmest year for the past 135 years. 2015 could be the year of serious climate changes. 2015 is raising the big question of whether the world leaders will take serious measures to reduce global warming and gas emissions.
There are still sectors of society that are not being invited, involved, or interested in participating in this debate. I think lots of good things are happening already. There is a tremendous number of institutions that are already working with a vision of landscape, of integration of institutions. But unless we bring synergies amongst these sectors, I think it'll be very difficult to overcome barriers that still exist. And I just want to mention one of those barriers, the perverse incentives for fossil fuels.
Vorrei dire a ciascuno di loro
One of the top religious leaders who are seeking changes is Pope Francis. Last May, the Vatican hosted a 5-day summit to look at whether humanity's dealings with nature were sustainable. This year, Pope Francis issued an encyclical on climate change and human ecology to parishioners across the globe. On Tuesday, the 21st of July 2015, the Pope addressed mayors and governors from major cities around the world at a Vatican summit whose aim was to urge global leaders to take bold action at this year's UN Climate Change Summit, saying it may be the last chance to tackle human-induced global warming.
Finalmente, yo diría que sobre esto hay que interesar a las Naciones Unidas.
We must get the United Nations to take an interest in this. I have a great hope for Paris Summit in November that a fundamental agreement is reached. I have a great hope, but undoubtedly the United Nations need to take a very strong stand on this phenomenon, most of all in the trafficking of human beings caused by the environmental phenomenon, the exploitation of people.
Esta convocatoria de la Academia Pontificia de las Ciencias.
And why has the Pontifical Academy of Science summoned mayors and local administrators? Because even this conscience spreads from the center towards the periphery. The most serious and deeper work is done from the periphery to the center, meaning from you to the conscience of humanity. The Holy See or this or that other country can make a nice speech at the United Nations, but if the real work doesn't come from the periphery towards the center, it will have no effect. There lies the responsibility of the mayors and urban local government. And I thank you very much to have come to this meeting as peripheries.
No tiene efecto. Y ahí es la responsabilidad de los síndicos, de los intendentes, de los alcaldes de las ciudades.
About 1.2 billion people identify as Catholic, more than 2/3 of them in the developing world. The Pope's stance can be seen as part of his campaign to reduce poverty and reflects that climate change is projected to hit the poorest people in the developing world much harder than the wealthy.